Hey everyone, welcome back to Coaching with the Bible. This is episode 180, season 4, episode 20. Our topic of the week is on taking a new leadership role. And before we do that, as we said last week, to sort of begin our podcast in a slightly different manner, a win and a learning. So the win this week is getting to episode 180. And the learning is also about getting to episode 180. And the reason I say that, and I know that I mentioned last week that those two things aren't necessarily the same thing, and usually a learning is related to a failure to some degree. It is the win is simply just, if nothing else, persisting long enough to get to 180 episodes week after week. That consistency of at least the effort and the recording, even if the quality isn't always great every week. And I'll be honest and say that I can't vouch for every episode being the greatest episode there ever was. But that said, there's something in the Cal Ripken kind of streak of doing it every week, of showing up every week, of trying to come up with new concepts and new content and to be creative and innovative and simply to just put this out there for people to consider, to think about, and to maybe implement some of the learnings and some of the ideas in their life. So 180 weeks straight. I'll clap for myself and for us at that moment, and it is a great accomplishment. I'm looking forward very much to 200 episodes, 20 weeks away, but we'll get there. Hopefully some of the things that we learn together will be meaningful and valuable and important to you, as I know for me that they are for me as well. So that's the win. The learning is, I think, related. I was listening to a podcast earlier this week that to win and succeed, you always have to make room for failure. And to fail as well, you have to make room for winning and success. Those two things go together. You cannot have one without the other. And so learning over the course of time how to do this, what to do, what to say, what not to say, how to prepare, how to think about this, and to appreciate that over the course of time in a deliberate manner of practice, of work, of effort, mainly quietly and privately, because other than the rarest of occasions when I've discussed a topic out loud with somebody in advance, much of what I'm doing is by myself, studying and preparing and reviewing content when no one's looking and hoping that it actually is meaningful. But at the same time, knowing that sometimes it's hard and sometimes I fail and sometimes it's not clear and sometimes it's too long. And so there's a lot in the failure structure that's attached with getting to 180 weeks. So if you want to think about it, there's sort of a parallel thing going on. There is the win of the consistency of the streak, of being there every week, of doing it every week, of getting to 180. And right below that, but running parallel to that, is the failure class going on at the same time. So there's the win and there's the learning. Our topic of the week is on taking a new leadership role. And I'll start this week slightly differently with the quote of the week. The quote of the week comes from a gentleman by the name of Sam Rayburn, which is this: "You cannot be a leader and ask other people to follow you unless you know how to follow too." You'll see why that quote is meaningful in just a couple of moments. And the reason why I'm talking this week about the idea of on taking a new leadership role, it sort of spurred a little bit in my mind over the last number of weeks with sort of the end of the NFL season, the football season in the United States. There's this always that mill of coaches changing positions, of people who had a certain role who lose their jobs, of coaches who are on the team who also lose their positions, and then this sort of like new, fresh crop of coaches who come in who become new head coaches for the first time or moving into new positions that they weren't in before. And the reality of it is that on some level, it is a shot in the dark when you're hiring someone to play that role. You prepare it, you interview, you check references, you ask questions, you make a decision, and you really sort of hope for the best. You can wrap the person around with all the things that they need, give them all of the support, but you never know if it's going to work or it's not going to work. You never know when a person steps up to some sort of a next level situation, position, whether they're going to succeed. And so moving into a new leadership role is daunting, and it's overwhelming, and it's scary, and it's risky, and it would seem that there's a lot of room for failure. And so the reason I bring it up specifically this week is because there is a new role that comes into play in this week's portion, which is that Aaron now is the high priest. I know we have that curse of knowledge idea going through our minds. We always know that Aaron is the high priest. Like when you say the name Aaron, brother of Moses, the first thing that comes out, oh yes, he's the high priest. In Hebrew, he's the Kohen Gadol. He's the first high priest appointed by God to be in that position. And so we never consider or think about the reality of the transitions that Aaron takes in his life from a leadership perspective. And that's why that quote is actually really powerful. When you think about who Aaron is and who Aaron was, for the entire period that Moses is not in Egypt, Aaron, his older brother, is effectively the leader of the people of Israel in Egypt. That's not like a week. That's like decades. So their father, Amram, is viewed as having been the leader for a period of time, but Aaron seems to take over. And at the point, and we know this from the point when Moses becomes the leader of the people, Moses is somewhat held back, uncomfortable, unwilling to take the role because maybe Aaron would be upset because maybe Aaron deserves to have that job, to be the leader of the people. And if you're selecting for roles, one could understand that maybe you might have chosen Aaron to be the leader and not Moses, who was missing in action, spending all that time in Midian with Jethro and his wife Tzipporah and the sheep. So there's transition one for Aaron from being the leader to being the second in command, to being the voice of Moses, to being an intermediary between Moses and Pharaoh on one level, but also between Moses and the people, because the people don't know Moses. So that's transition one. Then when they leave Egypt and now they're in the desert, Aaron has he's this number two kind of role. He's like, you might call the assistant CEO, right? He's, in the sages talk about him being a 1A, like he is the equal to Moses on some level, but he's not Moses. He's not viewed as like Moses either. And now, having transitioned once into that role of number two person, he's now transitioning again into this new role that's created, which is the high priest role. A role that didn't exist before, a role that, I'll be honest, if you're choosing a person to play that role and God is giving out that role right now, I might have thought that in the aftermath of Mount Sinai and the Revelation and the Ten Commandments and the whole thing, and assuming obviously that the stories are in sequence, and we know that this story, the appointment of Aaron, takes place after the story of the golden calf, after the things that he did in that story, that one might not have selected him for the role. And if you're a betting person, I'm not saying you should be betting on this, but if you're a betting person, Aaron might not be where you're going to place your money for this selection to be the high priest. But our problem is that we're cursed with the knowledge of knowing that he is the high priest and he's going to be that and play that role for the next however many years. And so he's selected for this new position. He's stepping into this position. This position needs definition. It needs understanding. It needs, you might well call it goals and metrics and objectives, KPIs. Like, what's the role of the high priest? It's also important to appreciate that Moses is not selected. And that, as Rabbi Sachs writes, this is the first version of a separation of church and state. Moses is the state. Aaron is the church or the synagogue or the tabernacle, however you want to describe it. But those two roles do not mix, and they should never mix. And in the sort of the corpus of the history of the people of Israel going forward, it really was maintained as a separate role. The high priest and the king and the kingship, let's just put Moses in that space of being the king, are not the same person. When they do happen later on in history in the Second Temple times, when they overlap and the Maccabean family becomes both the high priests and the kings, it's a disaster. And so there's always this separation between those two roles. There's actually a third role in the hierarchy that Rabbi Sachs discusses in his great article in his book on leadership, which is the role of the prophet. And so sometimes there's an overlap between someone who is a member of the priest family and it's a prophet. But the idea that the person is going to be all three or really two of the three ever isn't the case. You have kings, you have high priests, and you have prophets, and they have distinct and unique and special roles, and they play from a different place, and they attain their status differently. And it's really important to begin to appreciate all of the different facets and aspects that make up leadership within the biblical Jewish people. That said, we have this new transition. And so if this has happened to you, where suddenly you find yourself in a new position of leadership, I imagine the first thing that happens for you is after the celebration is this sort of dread of imposter syndrome that sort of falls on you, that I do not belong here, I do not fit in this room, I don't know how I'm even here, why am I even here, don't they know that I'm just, a 12-year-old kid? But you're in that position, you're in that place, you're playing this new role. I've had this experience where I went from being an assistant rabbi in a synagogue to the rabbi of a synagogue. That was a leap for me. When I left the rabbinate and went into organizational life, into a very senior role in an organization, that was new to me. Going into another organization later on in my career where I was the head person at the organization and milling around with the CEOs and executive vice presidents of leading the leading Jewish organizations in the United States, traveling with them to seats of power in the White House and overseas in Europe. Suddenly you realize, this is a different stadium. Like I'm on a different place and I really don't belong. Hopefully they don't realize and they don't kick me out. So, but there's a whole thing that comes with, how do I do this? How's this going to work? I step into this new role. So let's take Aaron. The first thing you want to do when you're stepping into a new role is to understand what the role is. And it's the leadership position, to understand perhaps what type of leadership I need to put into place here, or the type of leadership that I want to have in this space. What kind of leader do I want to be? There are a lot of different types of leadership that a person could step into. And it's really important to sort of synthesize and get those right, because you could get those wrong. And if you don't know what kind of leader you need to be, and it's sort of incongruent, you have a disaster awaiting on your hands. If you're going to be like really, really bossy, but the culture of the organization is very sort of decentralized and relaxed, that might not work. If you're going to, yell and scream and, use some colorful language, and that just simply doesn't fly there, then again, you're going to have a problem. So it's an appreciation, first and foremost, of what kind of leader do they need, and what kind of leader can I be in that moment. Flip it over for a second. If you're the person hiring for that position, that's also an important thing for you to consider, is what kind of leader do I need in this role? Transformational leader, servant leader, is visionary leadership, authentic leadership, tactical leadership, analytical leader. Like, what are we talking about here? It's really important to get that right. And if you're the person hiring and you get that wrong and you put the wrong person in place, you set your team back dramatically. You've put a person into a position and taken them out of a position that they probably were good at, and now they're at peril in terms of their career. And that's unfortunate, because you made a mistake in not assessing properly what the leadership position is. When you think about the role of the high priest and what that is to be an intermediary between God and the people. On some level, on one level representing God, on the other level representing the people in the presence of God. It's hard to argue with the choice of Aaron in playing that role. There is an emotive quality that has to be there. There has to be empathy. There has to be connection. There has to be compassion. Aaron is known throughout history in the Midrashic literature, and our sages talk about him as a man of peace, a person who pursued peace. He's viewed in the Bible itself. He's a leader earlier on. The Bible talks about the idea that he's super happy about the fact that Moses is selected to be the leader of the people, that there's not an ounce in his body of jealousy whatsoever vis-a-vis his brother being selected over him and him being passed for that role as the leader of the people. So he gets those things. He's obviously present at the position in the spaces when they're trying to get the people of Israel out of Egypt. He's there on at some level above everyone else with respect to Mount Sinai. He's in the room when Moses is making all those decisions. He's number two, like this. So there's a lot there. So he has all those qualities. I think the fundamental thing to appreciate with respect to the leader here in terms of what's happening is that he's effectively also, I think, introducing what we might call spiritual leadership. Spiritual leadership is different than political leadership. It's different than really just straight up, ethical leadership even, and any of the other ones. And so it's a combination of different types of leaderships. We're not going to get to all of them, but it's a mix of transformational leadership, of servant leadership, of ethical leadership, of visionary leadership, of authentic leadership. It's just a melding and a mixing of all these different kinds of things, which makes an appreciation that a spiritual leader of that ilk and that quality and that height is very hard to find a person who's going to play all those roles and all those things. And then when Aaron steps out of that and back into what you might call straight up political leadership, which happens in the story of the golden calf or before he becomes the priest, it's a disaster. It's really not his best moment. And so I think it's an important sort of appreciation. But as I said last week in producing these episodes, we can't get to everything in the course of our work on a topic. And we can always come back to it. We talked a lot about leadership before, but I do want to share simply sort of two thoughts that I read in an article. I think this was in Harvard Business Review. With respect to when you step into this new role. So number one, which comes from the book of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is to start with the end in mind. And this, in Judaism, we know this as an idea that with respect to what God had in mind with the creation of the earth, that God operated sort of, end to beginning and in the production of it. And the idea here is when you're taking on this new leadership role, think about what it is that you want to accomplish in this role so that you'll be ready to move beyond it and then working backward to map out how you will get there. This is a direct quote from the article. In so doing, you can shape your early actions to lay the foundation for long-term success. So when you think about the end, you work your way back to the beginning, you can put everything into place to actually get to the success that you actually want to accomplish. That's first. So have that in mind. Relatedly, then, there's a piece that's quoted in the article, written by somebody by the name of Dan Ciampa, who he's an executive coach, who defined a term called era planning, which was this. Your era is the anticipated duration of time you think you'll be in this new position. 5, 8, 10 years, whatever it is. Of course, you might stay longer, you might leave earlier, but you can make a rough guess as to it. And so you want to ask yourself 2 questions. You want to ask yourself, number one, as I wrap up this job, what will be true and what will be possible? Asking yourself what will be true is to outline the legacy that you're looking to create and the story you want to be told about your achievements. And so what will be true when we get 8 years, 10 years down the line with respect to my work? It's really important to sort of think about that way. So I might want to think about performance outcomes, organizational successes, development of people. That's one. And then the second thing is thinking about even beyond that, at what happens at that point. So what will be possible at that point once we get there? So now that we can tell this legacy story back as to what I accomplished, amazing, what was accomplished during my time, and now where are we now vis-a-vis the future in terms of what we're trying to accomplish going forward? That mixture of thinking is basically the epitome of the Peter Drucker quote, which is, the best way to predict the future is to create the future. And the best way to create the future is to think about what the future is, work backwards, implement along the way. And when you do that and you think about it that way, you can step into these new leadership roles, play these new leadership roles in its best way possible and in the most successful way possible, and really become the leader that you always were meant to be. That is Coaching with the Bible for this week. See you next week.